it's a county of England that's very close to my heart. I spent a lot of time there as a child and as a teenager as well. First went down with my parents. I think I was told about 3 years old. I could be making that up. And then later on went down independently of my parents when I was still early teenager, early teens.
By yourself?
Yeah. And we were fortunate enough to have family friends, sort of distantly related in a way, but they had managed to get hold of a cottage in a little fishing village called Mevagissey, which is I'm sure that a lot of Cornish names have meaning behind them, but I don't know whether Mevagissey is actually named after something. But it's a lovely little name, and it's a lovely little fishing port. Just fishing boats going out for mackerel and plaice and goodness knows what, crabs and lobsters. And the cottage itself isn't at the harbour. It's probably about 3/4 of a mile from the road to get from the village to get to the track that leads to the cottage, and the cottage is about 3/4 of a mile from the road again. So you'd have to, if you were in the village, you'd have to travel 3/4 of a mile along the road and then turn left, and you either walk along a stony lane or you walk down a slope and cross the stream if it's not too full, and into the woods, and then you can walk that way through the woods. But yes, it's a beautiful place to be, and a really old cottage. I can tell you bits about it if you like.
Yeah.
I think I was quite adventurous in a mild sort of way. It wasn't, I'm going to go and conquer the world kind of thing, because I knew where I was heading. But what I loved about Cornwall was its serenity, the peacefulness, and the nature, and it's by the sea. And we lived in a few miles from central London. And what I would do would be to pack, I think they used to call them sausage bags, but it's like a long cylindral bag, and it's actually an ex-army one. And so whatever's on the bottom, you can't get to it unless you take everything else out. So it's not like a backpack, but it's a great big long thing, and I used to just stuff stuff into that and pull the cord and tighten it up and stick that over my shoulder. It's quite big, it's quite long. It's about, I suppose from the ground it's about just over a metre and a half or something, metre and a quarter. I was fairly tall, but what I liked about it was you could do anything with it. You could sit on it, you could lean your head against it, you could, it didn't matter if it fell over and rolled along the ground or whatever, because it was really strong. And it wasn't always completely full. Well, it was mostly jeans and sometimes a pair of Wellingtons, because it used to get really muddy in Cornwall, and sometimes I would leave Wellingtons there in the cottage, but then somebody else would pick them up and wear them somewhere and then leave them somewhere else. So Wellingtons were always disappearing from the cottage, but it was just basic clothes, nothing fancy, jumpers, maybe a small coat, but I'd wear a coat to go down there perhaps. So it would be t-shirts, jumpers, jeans, and socks and things like that. Books, and food. So food for the journey, and food so that when I got there I'd have something to eat. So it wasn't terribly exciting what was in the bag, but it was everything I needed to survive.
Yeah, is it summer time or is it which time?
September time usually.
September.
Yeah, it's just after the tourist season, because it was quieter then. But yes, you asked how I got down there. I used to walk from our house probably about 1.5 miles to, it wasn't really a motorway, it was a dual carriageway, so it's got 2 lanes of traffic going in each direction. And I'd start hitchhiking, just at that, see if a car would stop. And quite often from that starting point, I'd often get a lift, maybe 2 or 3 miles or maybe 5 miles. And the further you got away from London, in a way, the easier it was to hitch a lift, because if you're close to London, lots of cars are just doing short journeys, so they don't bother to stop. They're maybe going half a mile and then turning off the road. But once you're on a long stretch of motorway, I think people presume that you're travelling quite a long distance. So quite often, if it's a single person in the car, they like to have someone to chat to, and you sort of swap stories. So yeah, I hitchhiked to Cornwall from London several times. But the first time I did it by myself, I was quite young. I was about 14 years old, I think. No, it never occurred to me that it would be dangerous. But a lot of people were really nice, really kind, and they take me further than I asked, so that they could drop me somewhere which was better for hitchhiking. The last thing you want is to be dropped in a city and then have to walk out of the city back to the main road. But I usually made it down there in about 3 hours. 3 or 4 hours at the most. Didn't really stop for lunch or anything. I'd have some cheese and apples and maybe a bit of bread and some water or whatever. Getting into Mevagissey, you go through an area called Pentewan, and there are lots of holiday chalets there. There's a big beach. It's called Pentewan Sands. And that's the beginning of a very steep hill. You go up the hill from Pentewan, and then at the top it's a crossroads. You can either go off to the right to Gorham, which is another small village, and lots of small fishing villages, or you drop straight down the other side of the hill into Mevagissey. And at the bottom of that hill, if you stop right at the bottom of that hill, you're at the beginning of the track that takes you into Cheesewarne Farm and then on to Heligan Woods. Quite some years ago now, it's been rejuvenated. It was sort of like a lost world. The woods were quite overgrown, not well tended. There weren't really very many paths that you could use to find your way through. The locals knew their way around. The few locals that used to go up there, it's mostly kids. But there was a very big house there, a big manor house called Heligan House. And that belonged to a chap called Sir John Tremaine. And that house was so grand, it would have coach and horses bringing the guests to dinner and to the ballroom for a night of entertainment and so on. But Sir John Tremaine was an adventurer, and he used to travel all over the world and bring back exotic plants and insects and dragonflies and so on, and created an amazing gardens in Heligan Woods that belonged to him and so on. And that has been resurrected more recently, well, over the last 30 years or so. But this is over 100 years ago that he was doing it. And we were just fortunate that there's the friends of our family, or relations of our family, had managed to get hold of a cottage in the woods. And they said that we could use it any time, so that's why I would hitchhike down to that part of the world. Yeah, it was probably about a 25-minute walk through the woods to get to Heligan House from the cottage. The cottage was called Butler's Cottage because the butler, sorry, butterflies just got in and out. The butler for the main house, I think, used to live when he had free time. He was given that cottage to live in, so it's known as the Butler's Cottage. And